The first time anyone in Coldwater Creek saw Monroe Carver truly stop what he was doing and stare, it was on account of a woman who arrived on the Tuesday stage with nothing but a cracked leather satchel, a jaw set like quarried stone, and eyes the color of pine needles after a hard rain. Monroe had been crouched in the dirt outside Hanley's general store, replacing the wheel spoke on old Gertrude Finch's delivery cart, his broad hands slicked with grease and his dark hair falling across his forehead when the stage rolled in from the east. He had not intended to look up. He rarely looked up when he was working, because looking up meant getting distracted, and getting distracted meant misses. Finch's cart would keep wobbling and her preserves would keep rattling off the shelf, and that simply would not do. But something about the sound of that particular stage made the fine hairs on the back of his neck stand at attention, and so he looked up, and that was that. She stepped down from the coach with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had learned the hard way not to trust things that were supposed to hold her. She wore a dove-gray traveling dress that had seen better days, a wide-brimmed hat that listed slightly to one side because the ribbon holding it had been tied in a hurry and not particularly well, and she carried that cracked satchel against her hip like it was the only thing in the world she fully trusted. She squinted into the afternoon sun, surveyed the single main street of Coldwater Creek, Montana Territory, and Monroe watched her face do something complicated. A quick flash of something that might have been disappointment followed by something that looked considerably more like determination. This was the spring of 1878, when the Montana Territory was still a place where people came to start over or to disappear, sometimes both at once, and Coldwater Creek sat tucked up against the eastern face of the Bitterroot Range like something that had rolled there and decided to stay. It was not a big town. It had Hanley's General Store, a livery stable run by a man named Pete Odom who had the personality of a fence post, a saloon called the Copper Bell that served 2 kinds of whiskey and 1 kind of trouble, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse when Reverend Aldrich was feeling generous, and a scattering of homes and outbuildings that climbed the lower slope of the mountain like they were trying to escape. What it also had, and what gave it a reputation that stretched all the way back to Missoula on one side and Helena on the other, was Monroe Carver. Nobody was entirely certain when Monroe had arrived in Coldwater Creek. He had simply been there one autumn, living in the big stone and timber cabin he had built himself up near the tree line, coming down into town when someone needed something fixed and going back up the mountain when the work was done. He was not a talkative man. He was not precisely an unfriendly man either. He was the kind of man who communicated primarily through what his hands did, and what his hands did was fix things. Broken wagon axles, collapsed fence lines, cracked window frames, failing well mechanisms, clogged chimneys, seized door hinges, bent rifle barrels, sprung clock springs, warped floorboards, frayed harness straps. If something in Coldwater Creek stopped working the way it was supposed to, people came to Monroe Carver, and Monroe Carver fixed it. He never turned anyone away. He never charged more than a thing was worth, and sometimes he charged nothing at all. He was 32 years old, built like the mountain he lived on, with shoulders that suggested he had spent a considerable portion of his life carrying heavy things, and a quietness about him that suggested he had spent a comparable portion of his life alone. His face was weathered in the way that faces get when they spend most of their time outdoors, deeply lined around the eyes from years of squinting into wind and sun, and there was a scar along his left jaw that he never explained and nobody in Coldwater Creek had ever been bold enough to ask about. People liked Monroe Carver the way they liked a reliable stove. They were grateful for him. They depended on him. They did not entirely understand him, and they had long since stopped trying. So when he looked up from Gertrude Finch's wagon wheel and stared at the woman coming off the Tuesday stage, it was something people noticed. Old Tom Briggs, who was sitting on the bench outside the Copper Bell whittling a stick that had long since ceased to have any purpose other than occupying his hands, noticed. Elma Hanley, who was sweeping her front step with the methodical devotion of someone who felt that order could be maintained by sheer willpower, noticed. Even Pete Odom, coming out of the livery to collect the stage horses, noticed. And Pete Odom was not a man given to noticing much. Monroe looked at the woman for a solid 3 seconds, which for him was roughly equivalent to gaping openly for 10 minutes, and then he looked back down at the wagon wheel, because there was still work to do and because he was not the sort of man who stared. The woman's name was Effie Easton. She was 26 years old. She had come from Billings by way of Laramie, by way of a life that had, in the course of the past 8 months, been taken apart piece by piece, and left in a heap on the floor like a clock that someone had disassembled, with no intention of putting back together. Her husband, James Easton, had died in January of a fever that moved through him like wildfire through dry grass, fast and final, and had left her with a small amount of cash, a farm outside Billings that was mortgaged well past what the land was worth, and a grief so heavy and so strange that she had not entirely figured out what to do with it yet. She had sold the farm. She had paid the mortgage. She had found herself in Billings with $42, a cracked leather satchel, a letter from her mother's cousin twice removed who lived in Coldwater Creek, and who had written, in a spidery hand on faded stationery, that there was a position available helping with the schoolroom and that room and board could be arranged at a reasonable rate. So Effie Easton had come to Coldwater Creek because it was the only door she could find that appeared to be, if not open, at least unlocked. She stood in the middle of the main street with her satchel on her hip and the afternoon light coming at her sideways, and she was thinking with some clarity that the letter had made Coldwater Creek sound like more of a town than it turned out to be. She was also thinking with rather less clarity that she was very tired and that she had not eaten since that morning's biscuit and that she needed to find her mother's cousin, whose name was Harriet Blum, before she fell over in the middle of the street and embarrassed herself. "You lost," said a voice. She turned. There was a man crouched beside a wagon wheel looking up at her. He was very large in the unhurried way that mountains are large, and he was looking at her with dark eyes that held a kind of steady attention she was not entirely prepared for. "Not lost," she said, "just new." "There's a difference," he allowed. "I'm looking for Harriet Blum." He set down the spoke he had been fitting and stood up, and he was considerably taller standing than crouching, which she registered with a slight adjustment of her chin. "Harriet's house is on the north end. Follow the main street past the livery, turn at the big cottonwood. She's the one with the red door." "Thank you," Effie said. "What's in the satchel?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The strap is about to give," he said, nodding at her bag with that same steady attention. "See how the leather's fraying at the buckle? Another day of hauling and the whole thing drops. I can fix it if you want." Effie looked down at the satchel. Sure enough, the leather at the main buckle was pale and cracked and clearly on its last fibrous prayer. She had not noticed it, or perhaps she had noticed it and filed it under things to worry about later, which was a category that had been growing considerably crowded of late. "I've only just arrived," she said, somewhat unnecessarily. "It won't take long," he said. He had already gone back to the wagon wheel, crouching down again, his hands finding the work like it was a conversation he had been having for years. He said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who did not exaggerate his abilities and did not see any reason to. She watched him for a moment. "What's your name?" "Monroe Carver." "I'm Effie Easton." He nodded, as though this was information that filed itself where it needed to go. "Harriet Blum's place, north end, red door. Come find me when you're settled. I'm usually around." She found Harriet Blum's place exactly as described, and Harriet Blum turned out to be a small, decisive woman of about 60, who had the energy of someone half her age and opinions she did not hesitate to share on any subject that presented itself. She welcomed Effie with a warm efficiency, showed her to a clean room at the back of the house with a window overlooking a small kitchen garden, and produced a meal of salt pork and cornbread within 30 minutes of Effie's arrival. They sat at the kitchen table in the long amber light of the Montana evening, and Harriet told Effie about Coldwater Creek, with the comprehensive authority of a woman who had lived in a place long enough to know all of its stories and most of its secrets. She told her about the schoolroom situation, which was that Reverend Aldrich was struggling under the double burden of his spiritual and educational duties, and would be very grateful for a capable assistant. She told her about the town's characters, about Pete Odom's fence-post personality and Tom Briggs's whittling and Elma Hanley's devotion to order. She told her about the copper bell and the trouble it occasionally generated. She told her about the Blackfoot communities in the broader territory, about the injustices that the government had been pressing down on them for years in ways that made Harriet's voice go tight and careful, the land grabs and the broken agreements, and the way a whole way of life was being squeezed from all sides. She told her about the cattle operations that were moving into the valley and about the land disputes that had been simmering between the big ranchers and the homesteaders for the better part of 3 years. And then, inevitably, she told her about Monroe Carver. "He came here in, 72, I suppose," Harriet said, refilling Effie's coffee cup without being asked. "Nobody knows where from exactly. He built that cabin up on the mountain himself, took him about a season. Then he started helping people, just showing up. Ada Cromwell's barn roof had collapsed in a snowstorm, and she was about a week away from losing her milk cow to the weather, and one morning she woke up and Monroe Carver was on her roof with a bundle of shingles. Never said much, just fixed it." "Does he do it for money?" Effie asked. "Sometimes, sometimes not. He knows the difference between someone who can pay and someone who can't, and he acts accordingly." Harriet paused. "He's a good man. People trust him. He keeps to himself more than is probably healthy, but that's the mountain air, I expect. Makes people private." "He offered to fix my satchel strap," Effie said. Harriet smiled, and there was something knowing in it that Effie decided not to examine too closely. "That sounds about right." She found him the next morning. He was at his workbench outside the livery, which he apparently used when he had work that required more space than Pete Odom minded yielding. The bench was massive, a thick slab of pine on heavy legs, covered with tools arranged in a way that suggested an extremely particular mind. Everything had a place, everything was in its place, and the efficiency of the arrangement was immediately apparent to anyone watching Monroe work. He was currently doing something intricate to what appeared to be a wagon wheel hub, his hands moving with that same unhurried certainty she had noticed the day before. He looked up when she came around the corner of the livery and he said, without particular ceremony, "You got settled." "I did. Harriet Blum is a force of nature." "She is," he agreed, and there was something in his voice that might have been warmth, though it was packed in so much quiet it was hard to be certain. "You bring the satchel." She had it over her shoulder. She handed it to him, and he turned it over in his hands, examining the strap with the focused attention he seemed to give to everything he looked at. His fingers found the fraying section immediately, pressed at it, tested the give of the remaining leather. He set it on the bench and went to a wooden box at the end, rifled through it, came back with a length of heavy leather and a curved needle and what appeared to be a small punch. "This is a good satchel otherwise," he said. "The body's solid, just the strap that's giving out. My husband bought it," Effie said, and then immediately wished she had not because it was a secret but because she had not intended to say it. It had just come out the way things do when you are tired and in a new place and slightly off balance. Monroe did not look up from the satchel, but there was a brief pause in his work, just a beat that told her he had heard her. "He's not with you. He died in January." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She watched him work. He was cutting a new piece of leather to match the worn one, his hands steady and precise. "You're very good at that. I've had practice." "How long have you been in Coldwater Creek?" 6 years this September." "Where were you before?" He was quiet for a moment, working the punch through the leather with a series of careful, even strokes. "A lot of places, Idaho, Oregon for a while. I went up through the Northwest Territories for a year before that. Before that I was in Missouri. That's a lot of ground." "I was looking for where to stop," he said simply, and there was no drama in it, just the plain statement of a fact. Stopped here. Effie sat down on the overturned crate beside the bench. She was not sure why she stayed. The satchel did not require her presence to be repaired. But the morning was cool and bright, and there was something deeply restful about watching Monroe Carver work. The same way it was restful to watch a river moving, the sense of something going exactly where it was supposed to go, doing exactly what it was meant to do. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked. "Fixing things for people." He glanced at her sideways, and it was the most direct look he had given her since the day before, a brief flash of those dark, steady eyes. "No," he said. "A thing that's broken is just a thing that needs attention. Most things can be fixed if someone takes the time." "Not everything," she said, and she had not meant it to sound as weighted as it did. Monroe set down the punch and looked at her directly, not in the way that people sometimes look at young widows, with that particular combination of pity and appetite that Effie had learned to recognize and dislike, just looking, attentive and serious and without any apparent agenda. "No," he said, "not everything, but more things than people usually give credit for." He handed the satchel back to her. The strap had been replaced entirely, the new leather fitted and stitched with small, even stitches that were a considerable improvement on the original. It looked, Effie thought, better than it had when James had first bought it. "What do I owe you?" she asked. "Nothing, Monroe. You're new in town and you're starting over," he said, turning back to the wagon hub with the finality of a man who had stated his position and saw no need to elaborate. "That's not the time to be charging people for things." She stood there for a moment with the repaired satchel in her hands, feeling something she could not quite name, something that was warm and uncomfortable and unexpectedly sharp. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, already back at work. She started at the schoolroom the following Monday. Reverend Aldrich, who was a thin, earnest man with a forehead that perpetually appeared to be engaged in intense calculation, received her with the barely concealed relief of someone who has been drowning slowly for years and has just been thrown a rope. The schoolroom held 14 children ranging in age from 6 to 13, and managing them while also delivering spiritual guidance to the adults of Coldwater Creek had been stretching the Reverend in ways he had not entirely recovered from. Effie had not taught school before, but she had been schooled well herself, further east in Ohio before she had come west with James, and she had a way with children that she had not known she had until she was standing in front of them. She was patient and precise, and she had a gift for explaining things in a way that made them feel less like obstacles and more like puzzles. And by the end of the first week, the children were doing a thing she suspected they had not done for some time, which was paying attention. She settled into Harriet's house and into Coldwater Creek with the careful, deliberate movements of someone learning new terrain. She walked the town. She learned its rhythms, the morning traffic at Hanley's, the midday quiet, the evening sociability that gathered on the porches when the heat of the day passed. She learned its people, their names and their histories and their particular combinations of kindness and difficulty. She learned that the cattle ranchers, specifically a man named Calhoun Briggs, who was old Tom Briggs's nephew, and a substantially less agreeable version of the same raw material, had been pushing the smaller homesteaders on the north end of the valley with legal pressure, and occasionally less legal varieties of pressure, and that this had been a source of considerable anxiety for people who had come out here on the promise of land that was theirs. She also kept running into Monroe Carver. Not in the way that felt engineered, more in the way that you keep encountering a particular feature of a landscape when you move through it regularly. He was there because he was always there, moving through the town on whatever task had presented itself that day, always with that workman's purposefulness, always with those hands doing something. She would see him fixing the hinge on the church door and stop to say good morning. She would encounter him outside the Hanleys, helping Elma maneuver a new counter into the store, and they would exchange a few words. She would find him at his bench outside the livery on mornings when the weather was fine, and she would stop, and they would talk, and the conversations were never long and never particularly dramatic, but they accumulated the way stones accumulate in a wall, quietly and with increasing solidity. She told him about Ohio. He listened with the focused attention he gave to mechanical things, as though her words were components he was examining for their function and fit. She told him about James, carefully at first and then less carefully as the weeks passed, and she found that Monroe was the kind of man who could hold grief without flinching from it. She told him about the schoolroom and the children and the particular joy of watching a child's face change when something clicks into place in their understanding. He told her in pieces about himself. Not easily, not in any kind of rush, but gradually, the way a landscape reveals itself through fog as you walk forward into it. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a carpenter and a woman who had died when he was 11. He had learned his father's trade and then expanded it, learning metalwork from a blacksmith in St. Louis, learning timber construction from a man in Oregon who had been building in the mountains for 30 years, picking up electrical knowledge and mechanical knowledge, and what he could from every person who knew something he didn't, because knowledge was the only currency Monroe Carver had fully trusted since the age of 11. He had left Missouri at 22, following an event he described only as a disagreement with circumstances that had gotten out of hand, which Effie did not push on, recognizing in the brevity of the telling that it was something that still sat tender. He had moved west and kept moving until the mountains and the wide sky of Montana had done something to him that felt like permission to stop. He had been alone for a long time, and he was accustomed to it, but he said this without the defensive insistence of someone who has decided they prefer loneliness. He said it the same way he said most things, as a plain report on the state of things as he found them. It was a Thursday in late June when the real trouble started, or rather when trouble that had been simmering finally boiled. Effie was at the schoolroom when Ada Cromwell's boy, a 10-year-old named Daniel with an impressive throwing arm and an equally impressive disregard for the concept of sitting still, came running in with his face white and his breath coming in hard spurts. "Mrs. Easton," he said, "Mr. Calhoun's men are at our place. They told my mama she's got a week to get off the land or they're going to take the house down around her." Effie dismissed the room immediately and took Daniel back to the Cromwell homestead, which was about 2 miles up the north end of the valley on a stretch of good bottomland that Ada had worked since her husband had died 3 years ago. When they arrived, she found Ada Cromwell standing on her porch with the rigid stillness of a woman in the grip of something very cold, and 2 men on horses in her front yard who had the flat, professional calm of people who were doing a job they had done before and expected to do again. The men worked for Calhoun Briggs. They had delivered a notice claiming that Ada's original homestead claim had a defect in the filing, a technical irregularity that Calhoun's lawyers had apparently located after quite a bit of looking. The notice said she had until the 1st of July to vacate. Ada had papers. She showed Effie the original filing, the land grant, the receipts from 5 years of improvements. The whole thing smelled, to Effie's Ohio-educated, formerly married to a man who had been careful about papers nose, like the kind of legal maneuvering that does not survive serious scrutiny. But she was a schoolteacher, not a lawyer, and she knew the limits of what her reading of the papers could accomplish. She went to find Monroe. He was up at his cabin that afternoon. She had been told he would be, because he had been up there for 3 days working on some project she had not asked about. She had never been to his cabin. It was a mile past the tree line up a trail that was clear enough to follow if you had been pointed at it, which Harriet had done with precise directions and the mild expression of a woman adding 2 and 2 and arriving at 4 without fanfare. The cabin was exactly what she had expected and more than she had imagined. It was built from stone and timber, solid and angular against the mountain, with a wide covered porch along the front face and a workshop built onto the side that was nearly as large as the main structure. The view from the porch, down the long slope through the trees to the valley below, was the kind of view that made you stop and feel your own smallness in a way that was not diminishing but clarifying. Monroe was in the workshop when she arrived, bending over a piece of metalwork she could not immediately identify. He looked up when she came in, not surprised exactly, but with a kind of alertness that suggested he had heard her on the trail and had been monitoring her approach the way mountain people learn to monitor the sounds of the world around them. "Ada Cromwell has a problem," Effie said, and she told him everything, including what the papers said and what the men had said, and the look on Ada's face and Daniel's white expression running into the schoolroom. Monroe listened without interrupting, and when she was done he set down his metalwork, wiped his hands on a rag, and was quiet for a long moment. "Calhoun's been doing this for 2 years," he said, "picking at the edges of the claims, finding technicalities. He got the Hartley place last fall. Can he do this legally? His lawyers say he can. Whether they're right depends on who you ask and what you can prove." He looked at her steadily. "Ada Cromwell doesn't have a lawyer." "No. There's a man in Helena named Everett Pierce who handles land claims. He's honest, which is rarer than it should be. The question is whether he can get out here before the 1st of July and whether his presence would change anything. Can you write to him?" Monroe was already moving toward the corner of the workshop where there was a small writing desk that looked absolutely incongruous among all the tools and materials, a fine old desk with papers stacked neatly on it. "I can do better than write. I can ride to the telegraph office in Finley Crossing tomorrow morning and send a wire. Pierce has an office there. If he's in Helena, we can get word. And if Pierce can't come in time—" Monroe turned from the desk and looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, because it was built of several things at once: resolve and something darker, and something that might have been the particular weariness of someone who has seen this same story before in different landscapes. "Then we deal with it another way." He rode to Finley Crossing the next morning, 20 miles each way, on a big roan horse named Clement that Monroe had owned for 7 years, and clearly regarded with something close to affection. He was back by evening with a response. Everett Pierce would arrive on the Friday stage, 3 days before Ada Cromwell's deadline. Those 3 days were among the more eventful Effie had experienced since arriving in Coldwater Creek. The news that Calhoun Briggs was making another move on the homesteaders spread through the town with the speed that news travels in small places, which is to say very fast and with considerable enhancement of detail. Several of the other homesteaders on the north end came to Harriet's house, because Harriet's house had, in the weeks since Effie's arrival, developed a kind of informal gathering function that Harriet appeared to encourage with great satisfaction. They sat around the kitchen table and compared papers and told their stories, and Effie listened and organized what she heard and made notes, because someone needed to make notes. Monroe came to Harriet's house on the second evening, something he apparently did not do with great frequency, because Harriet greeted him at the door with an expression of mild and carefully concealed delight. He sat at the table and looked at Effie's notes and asked questions that were precise and useful, and which revealed, to Effie's growing understanding of the man, that Monroe Carver was considerably more than a man who fixed axles and window frames. He understood land law the way he understood mechanical systems, as something with internal logic that could be traced and followed and occasionally predicted. He had been watching the Calhoun situation for 2 years, and he had his own documentation, filed with the county recorder in Finley Crossing, of the improvements the homesteaders had made and the dates of their original claims. "You've been preparing for this," Effie said, looking at the neat stack of papers he had placed on the table. "I figured it would come," he said. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He considered this. "I was hoping I was wrong," he said. "And I didn't want to worry people before there was something concrete to worry about." She looked at him across the table in the warm lamplight of Harriet's kitchen, with the other homesteaders talking quietly around them, and she felt something that was not grief and not loneliness, and not the careful neutral contentment she had been building around herself like a sensible house. Something warmer and more complicated, something she recognized from a long time ago. She looked back at her notes and said nothing. Everett Pierce arrived on the Friday stage and turned out to be a compact, shrewd man of about 50. With a briefcase he treated like a third child, and an eye for detail that matched Monroe's in its accuracy, if not its quietness. He and Monroe conferred in low voices for an hour while Effie organized the homesteader's papers into a coherent sequence, and when they were done Pierce looked at the assembled documents and said he believed the filing defect that Calhoun's lawyers were relying on was a manufactured technicality that would not survive a proper examination. "Will it survive Calhoun's lawyers?" Ada Cromwell asked. "That depends on the territorial judge," Pierce said honestly. "But I believe the case is sound, and I've dealt with Calhoun before. He picks fights he thinks he can win cheaply. Present him with a real legal challenge and he generally recalculates." What followed was 3 days of tense, paper-heavy, surprisingly not entirely unpleasant activity. Pierce and Monroe and Effie sat in the church, which was the largest available space, surrounded by maps and land claims and correspondence, building the counterargument. Effie organized and transcribed, and also occasionally pointed out logical inconsistencies in their framing that Monroe acknowledged with a nod and Pierce acknowledged with a raised eyebrow, and the remark that she had a sharp mind. "I was a carpenter's wife," she said. "You learn to read plans." On the day of Ada Cromwell's deadline, Pierce rode out to Calhoun Briggs's ranch with Monroe beside him and a file of documentation that represented several years of careful record-keeping and 3 days of intensive organization. Effie had wanted to go too, but Monroe had looked at her with those steady eyes and said, "You've done the work. Let Pierce carry it." She had not liked it, but she had recognized the practical sense of it. Calhoun Briggs, faced with a competent lawyer and a documented countercase, did what Pierce had predicted. He recalculated. There was more correspondence, more meetings, the process that the law sets in motion when someone powerful meets something that pushes back effectively. But Ada Cromwell's deadline passed without incident, and then a week passed, and then the beginning of July became the middle of July, and when the formal response came from Calhoun's lawyers 2 weeks later, it was a retreat dressed in legal language, a withdrawal of the filing defect claim, a notice that the matter would not be pursued further at this time. Ada Cromwell cried when Effie told her. Not the helpless kind of crying, but the other kind, the kind that happens when something very heavy is set down, and your body has to process the absence of the weight. Monroe was at the door of Ada's house when Effie came out, standing in the late afternoon light with his hat in his hands. He had this habit, she had noticed, of taking his hat off when he was indoors or in the presence of something that moved him. He was not indoors now, but he had his hat in his hands and he was looking out across Ada's bottomland with its good soil and its kitchen garden and its small outbuildings, and his face had the expression that she had come to recognize as his version of deep feeling, not hidden exactly, but compressed and still. "You saved her place," Effie said. "Pierce saved it. The documentation saved it. You organized the documentation. You kept the documentation for 2 years because you knew this would come." He turned and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The late light was doing something complicated to the valley, turning the grass gold and the shadows long and blue, and the mountains beyond were taking on that evening purple that Effie had been watching develop over the course of the summer with a steady accumulation of wonder. "Effie," he said, and the way he said it, carefully, like he was setting something fragile down, made her breath do something she had not asked it to do. "Yes. I'm glad you came to Coldwater Creek," he said, "on the Tuesday stage. With the cracked satchel." She laughed and it surprised her, the sound of it coming out warm and unguarded, and she watched something in Monroe's face shift, a brief, wondering motion, as though the sound had reached somewhere he had not expected. "I'm glad too," she said. He put his hat back on and they walked back toward town together in the long evening, not touching, not saying much, but walking with the easy proximity of two people who have stopped maintaining careful distances. Summer moved through Coldwater Creek with the unhurried generosity of Montana summers, big-skied and warm-aired, smelling of pine and sage, and the particular sharpness that comes off the mountains when the afternoon clouds build. Effie's life in the town deepened and took root in the way that lives do when they find the right soil. The children in the schoolroom bloomed under her attention. She learned to bake in the high altitude, which required adjustments to every recipe she knew, and she and Harriet had several excellent arguments about whether leavening needed to be reduced and by how much. She learned where the huckleberries grew on the lower slope and spent 2 Saturdays in August picking them with a group that included Daniel Cromwell and 3 other children who were significantly more interested in throwing berries at each other than in filling their pails. She learned that Coldwater Creek was a community with real depth in it, people who cared about their neighbors and felt the weight of each other's hardships, and that this depth was not diminished by the town's smallness, but in some ways enhanced by it. She also fell in love with Monroe Carver, which she did with the same combination of deliberateness and helplessness that she suspected most of life's important events involved. It was not a sudden thing, or rather it was not one sudden thing. It was many things, each of which was small on its own and only visible as something larger when she allowed herself to look at them together. It was the way he handed her coffee when she came to his workshop early enough in the morning that the dew was still on the grass, without asking whether she wanted it because she always wanted it and he had noticed. It was the way he listened to the children when they came to him with small mechanical questions, giving them the same serious attention he gave to everyone, crouching to their level with his enormous hands gentle around whatever small broken object they had brought him. It was the way he looked at the mountains, not with the performed appreciation of someone doing what they were supposed to do, but with the genuine attention of a man in a conversation with something he loved. It was the evening in late August when she came to his workshop and found him sitting on the porch in the falling dark with a book on his knee, and his face held in the particular stillness of a man fully at peace with himself in his space. And she had sat down in the other chair without being invited, and he had shifted slightly to accommodate her presence, and they had sat in silence for an hour watching the stars come out over the mountain. And the silence had felt like the most eloquent conversation she had ever had with anyone. It was the morning he had asked about James, careful and direct, the first time he had asked directly and not waited for her to bring it up. She had told him about James properly then, not just the death but the life, the good man he had been, steady and kind and not entirely suited to the West but willing to try it because she had wanted to come, and she had cried a little telling it, and Monroe had sat with her and not tried to fix it, which was the right thing to do, and which she had not entirely expected from him but had received with enormous gratitude. She had told Harriet one evening, very casually, that she found Monroe Carver to be a remarkable person, and Harriet had looked at her over the edge of her coffee cup, with an expression of such comprehensive knowing that Effie had changed the subject immediately. She had told herself several times that she was not in a position to fall in love with anyone, that it was too soon, that she had come to Coldwater Creek to rebuild a life and not to acquire entanglements, that Monroe was reserved and private and possibly not interested, and all of these things were reasonable, and none of them were working. Monroe, for his part, was conducting a similar internal conversation that was, if anything, somewhat noisier, because Monroe Carver was a man who understood his own mechanisms well enough to know when something was not operating according to its usual parameters. He had been alone for a long time. He had made a kind of peace with the solitude, not a happy peace but a functional one, the peace of a person who has determined that they are not suited to the demands of closeness and has organized their life accordingly. He had his cabin and his work and the clean, reliable company of the mountain, and this had been enough, Or at least it had been sufficiently enough that he had not allowed himself to examine the word too closely. And then Effie Easton had come off the Tuesday stage with her cracked satchel and her pine-green eyes and her particular combination of open feeling and practical intelligence. And something in Monroe had registered it the way a compass registers north, not as a choice, but as an orientation. He thought about this for a considerable portion of August without doing anything about it, because he was not a man who acted on incomplete assessments. He turned it over the way he turned over a mechanical problem, examining it from different angles, checking his reasoning. She was recently widowed. She was still grieving. She had come here to rebuild, not to attach herself to another person's life. She deserved the space to find her own footing. He was not the easiest person to be close to. He knew this about himself. He was too quiet, too contained, too given to communicating through actions rather than words. But then again, the evenings on his porch when she came to sit with him were the best part of his days now, and the mornings at his workbench were better when she stopped by on her way to the schoolroom. And when he came into town and she was not there, some quality of the day was diminished in a way that he could not attribute to anything else, and he had stopped pretending he could. September arrived with a sharpness in the air that came down off the peaks at night, a reminder that the mountains took summer back by degrees and winter would not wait indefinitely. The aspens on the lower slope began to turn, and the turning happened fast, the way things happen in the mountains, one day green, the next gold, the next blazing, and then the leaves down and the bare branches against the sky and the snow line creeping downward from the high peaks. On a Saturday in early September, Monroe came to Harriet's house and knocked on the front door, which he had never done before. He usually encountered Effie in town or she came to him, but he had decided, with the deliberate finality of a man who has examined all the angles and arrived at a conclusion, that it was time to be direct. Harriet opened the door, registered Monroe's hat and hands and his expression, and said, "She's in the back garden," with a comprehensive equanimity that suggested she had been waiting for this knock for some time. Effie was in the kitchen garden pulling up the last of the late beans, with the focused attention she gave to everything. She looked up when Monroe came around the corner of the house, and something in her face shifted in the way he had come to recognize, a subtle lighting, and he felt it in the middle of his chest like a bell being rung. "Monroe," she said. "Effie," he said. He was still holding his hat. He looked at it briefly as though checking whether it was doing what it was supposed to, which it wasn't, because what it was supposed to do was be on his head and it was not on his head. She set down the beans and waited. She had learned that with Monroe you waited, that his words came in their own time and did not respond well to being pulled. "I'd like to take you for a ride," he said, "up the mountain. There's something I want to show you, if you'd like to come." "I would," she said. He had 2 horses from Pete Odom's livery, Clement and a smaller gray mare that Effie had learned to handle over the summer under Monroe's instruction, offered in the same quiet, precise manner he offered everything. They rode up the mountain trail in the September morning, through the aspens that were blazing gold and yellow, the light coming through the leaves in plaits and shafts that were so beautiful it was almost aggressive. Monroe knew every bend of the trail, every rock and root, and he rode with the relaxed authority of a man on familiar ground, and Effie rode beside him and watched the mountain reveal itself around them. He took her above the tree line, where the trail opened onto a shelf of rock that looked south and west, and the view was simply everything. The whole valley below, the winding silver of the creek, the patchwork of the homesteads, the town at the center of it like a small, deliberate gathering, and beyond the valley the next range of mountains, and beyond that more mountains, folding away into a blue distance that had no visible end. They sat on their horses in the brilliant morning and looked at it. "I come up here when things get heavy," Monroe said. "It helps. I can see why. I wanted you to have this." He paused. "Not the view. The view doesn't belong to me. I mean I wanted you to know it was here. When things get heavy for you." She turned to look at him, and he was looking at the view, not at her, with that profile of his that the mountain light was treating with considerable sympathy. "Monroe," she said. He turned then and looked at her, and there was nothing compressed or contained in his expression. It was plain and open and a little terrified, which she had not expected from him, but which was, she found, the most moving thing she had ever seen on a human face. "I think I'm in love with you," he said. "I've been thinking about it for a while, and I keep coming to the same conclusion, and I thought you should know. You don't have to," he stopped. "You don't have to do anything about it. I know you're still Monroe," she said again, softer. "I know it hasn't been very long since James, and I'm not asking you to Monroe." He stopped. "I think I'm in love with you too," she said. "I've been thinking about it for a while, and I also keep coming to the same conclusion, and I thought you should know." The silence that followed was the best silence Effie had ever been part of. The mountain held it, and the aspens held it, and the September sky held it. And Monroe Carver looked at her with those dark eyes that held a depth of feeling she had been aware of for months, and had been telling herself, with decreasing conviction, she was probably misreading. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and his hand was warm and calloused and very careful, as though he was holding something he intended to take good care of. "All right then," he said, which was an extremely Monroe Carver way of saying everything he wanted to say, and she laughed, and he looked at her laughing with an expression of such unguarded wonder that she felt the laugh catch in her throat and turn into something softer. "All right then," she agreed. They rode back down the mountain in the gold September light, and when they came into town, Monroe still had her hand because neither of them had let go when they came to the flat ground. And Tom Briggs on his bench noticed, and Elma Hanley sweeping her step noticed, and Harriet, who happened to be coming out of the general store at that moment, noticed, and did not attempt at all to conceal her satisfaction. Monroe came to Harriet's house for supper that evening formally, with his hat on and taken off at the door, and a jar of the honey he kept from 2 hives near his cabin, which was the closest thing to bringing flowers that Monroe Carver's personal vocabulary of gesture offered. Harriet received him with enormous warmth and an excellent pot roast, and the demeanor of a woman who has arranged things to her satisfaction and sees no need to draw attention to how thoroughly she has done so. Supper was a long, warm, good-humored affair, the 3 of them at Harriet's kitchen table with the lamp going gold and the night cooling outside the windows, and Effie watched Monroe in the contained warmth of an indoor space and a shared meal, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time, not replaced, not healed in the simple sense, but held and accommodated and given new company. After supper, Monroe helped Harriet with the dishes, which Harriet protested and Monroe did anyway. And then he and Effie sat on the front porch in the cool September night with the stars coming out over the mountain, and they talked for a long time about the things people talk about when they are first opening themselves to each other fully. About what they wanted, about what they feared, about the past and about the future. About James and about the years Monroe had spent moving, and about the strange, careful way they had each been put back together enough by Coldwater Creek to arrive at this particular porch on this particular night. The courtship that followed was thoroughly Monroe Carver in its character, which is to say it was quiet and practical and full of small acts that accumulated into something grand. He brought her things he had made or found or repaired, a small wooden box with a fitted lid for her papers, a knife with a new handle she could use in Harriet's kitchen, a carved figure of a horse that he put on her windowsill and which she moved to her bedside table. He took her riding on Sunday mornings when the weather held, showing her the mountain with the pride of a man sharing something he loves with someone he loves more. He sat with her in the evenings at Harriet's or at his cabin, and the silence between them was the kind that 2 people build together over time, warm and accommodating and full of unspoken meaning. She taught him things in return. She read to him, which he liked enormously and had not expected to be offered. She read from the books Harriet had, and from the small stack she had brought in her cracked-hand now-mended satchel, fiction and history, and one rather dense philosophical text she had been working through since Ohio, and which Monroe engaged with a sharpness that delighted her. She told him things about people, explaining social nuances that he missed or ignored with the directness of a man who had spent years on a mountain and found human complexity sometimes puzzling. She laughed at him gently when he said something inadvertently blunt in a social situation, and told him what the better version would have been, and he took this instruction with the same willing humility he brought to learning any new skill. October came and the mountains were iron and slate, and the snow was down to the lower reaches of the peaks, and the mornings were sharp and cold, and the smell of wood smoke was in every corner of the town. Monroe had his cabin well prepared, as it was every year before winter, firewood stacked deep, supplies laid in, the structure itself tight and warm against what the mountains sent down. He brought extra firewood to Harriet's house, stacking it in the side yard with that same unhurried efficiency, and Harriet thanked him, and Effie stood at the kitchen window watching him work and thought about what she wanted. She had been thinking about what she wanted for several weeks with increasing clarity. She had not come to Coldwater Creek looking for love. She had come looking for a place to start over, a way to rebuild after the collapse of a life she had loved and lost. And she had found the place, and she had found the life, and she had found, unexpectedly and with a fullness that still surprised her sometimes, the love. James had been her first love, and she honored that, would honor it always. But she was 26 years old, and she had a great deal of life ahead of her, and she was in love with a man who looked at her the way Monroe Carver looked at her, with that deep, steadfast attention, and she knew what she wanted. She brought it up herself, on a Sunday afternoon in late October when they were at his cabin, and the fire was going, and the snow was coming down outside the windows in the soft, deliberate way that Montana snow comes, meaning business. "Monroe," she said, "have you thought about what this is going to look like in the long run?" He was mending a piece of tack on his knee, focused and sure-handed. He looked up. "I have," he said, and he set the tack down, which meant he was giving the conversation his full attention. "I've thought about asking you to marry me," he said, with the directness she had come to love. "I've been uncertain of the timing, given that it's only been since January that you lost James." "It's been almost a year," she said. "I know. And this is not the same love I had for James. It's not a replacement, it's its own thing. I know that too." She looked at him across the fire. "Are you asking me?" A silence, the snow coming down outside, the fire popping, Monroe Carver looking at her with everything he was in his face, unsuppressed and unhidden. "Effie Easton," he said, and he stood up from his chair and crossed to where she was sitting and knelt down in front of her, which was an act that looked somewhat at odds with his dimensions but was performed with complete and unembarrassed sincerity. "Will you marry me?" It was not quite a question. It was the declaration of a man who had reached a conclusion he believed in, but there was a reaching in it, and a hoping, and an anxiety that she found she loved him more for. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He took both of her hands in his and looked at them, and then looked at her, and she saw the wave of relief and joy move through him the way weather moves through a landscape, entirely and without reservation. "All right then," he said, which made her laugh again, and he smiled, and it was the fullest smile she had ever seen on him, unguarded and bright, and she thought that she would spend the rest of her life working to produce that smile as often as possible. They told Harriet that evening. Harriet sat down at the kitchen table, which she rarely did mid-evening, and held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the two of them standing in her kitchen and said, "Well, it certainly took the two of you long enough," with the air of someone who has been patient for months about a very obvious outcome. They were married in the Coldwater Creek church on a Saturday in November, which was cold and clear and brilliant, the kind of winter day that the territory produced occasionally as a reminder that it was not only brutal. Reverend Aldrich performed the ceremony with a warmth that spoke well of how much he had come to regard both of them. The whole town came, because in Coldwater Creek the whole town came to weddings, and the church was full with the familiar faces that had become, in the course of 8 months, Effie's people: Ada Cromwell and Daniel, Elma Hanley, Tom Briggs, who wept openly and then denied it, Pete Odom, who did not weep and stood with the fenced expression of someone moved by something they don't entirely understand. Harriet sat in the front pew in her best dress and watched with the serene satisfaction of a woman who has played a hand she has been holding for months and played it very well. Effie wore her best dress, which was not the dove gray of her arrival but a deep blue wool that Harriet had helped her alter, with her hair pinned up and a small bunch of dried wildflowers from the summer picking carried in one hand. She walked up the church aisle and Monroe was at the end of it, in a clean dark coat she had never seen him wear before, and he looked at her coming toward him with that unguarded steady regard, and she felt entirely certain, the way she had been trying to feel certain about things for the past year, finally and without reservation. She took his hands at the altar, and they were warm and familiar and safe. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, but when it came to the moment at the end where you might say something more personal, Monroe turned to her with those dark eyes and said, quiet enough that it was just between them, "I intend to take care of you and be taken care of by you, and whatever's broken we'll fix it together, both of us." She gripped his hands tighter and said, "I intend the same." Reverend Aldrich pronounced them married and Monroe kissed her, which he did with a particular concentrated attention she was coming to recognize as his version of complete commitment, and the church erupted in the warm, undignified noise of a small community celebrating. There was a dinner at Harriet's house, the large kitchen and front room thrown open and tables pulled together, and contributed dishes crowded onto every surface. There was music from a fiddle that Tom Briggs produced from under his bench outside the Copper Bell, which turned out to be the one skill Tom Briggs had that fully justified his existence, because he was a remarkable fiddler. People danced in Harriet's front room, the furniture pushed back, the floorboards taking the impact with stoic Montana resilience. Monroe danced with Effie, which he did not do well and did not pretend to, and she danced with him anyway and laughed at both of them and he laughed too, and the dancing was not the point. The closeness was the point, the public declaration of belonging to each other in the warm noise of their community. They went up the mountain to Monroe's cabin that night, in the clear cold dark with the stars extraordinary overhead and their breath making small clouds and the snow crunching under their feet on the trail. The cabin was warm from the fire Monroe had banked before coming down for the wedding, and it received them like something that had been waiting. The winter was long and deep and very good. Effie came down to the schoolroom 3 times a week through the winter months, which was what the weather and the footing on the mountain trail allowed for reliably, and on the other days she was at the cabin. The cabin, which had been a man's space in the specifically stark way that solitary men's spaces tend to be, underwent a gradual and organic transformation in the presence of Effie's belongings and habits, and eye for what a space needed. Books appeared on shelves. A rug arrived that Monroe had traded some repairs for, in warm red and brown tones. A chair near the fire was claimed as hers and refitted with cushions. The kitchen, which Monroe had used with the same efficient utilitarianism he brought to his workshop, began producing things that were more than fuel. She cooked with an inventiveness that surprised him, and which he received with quiet gratitude and an attention to detail that she found she cooked for, the way you work toward an audience you respect. They settled into each other with a naturalness that Effie had not expected, or perhaps had hoped for but had not allowed herself to count on. There was an ease to it, not the ease of things being simple, because they were two particular and complicated people, but the ease of things fitting, the way a well-made joint fits, precisely because of how it was made, not despite it. Monroe expanded under her attention in ways that were not dramatic but were clear to anyone who knew him well, and Harriet knew him well enough to remark on it to Effie one spring morning when the snow was receding and the world was coming back to color. He laughed more. He came into town more often. He accepted invitations instead of declining them. He talked more freely to people, not voluminously, not ever, but the compressed private quality of him had loosened somewhat, like a door that swings easier when its hinges have been properly tended. Effie found in Monroe a steadiness she had not known she needed until she had it, a solidity that was not rigid but reliable, the deep, reliable kind that comes from a person who has examined their own foundations and built consciously on what they found. He was present with her in a way that felt extraordinary, not because it was attention all the time, but because, when he was with her, he was fully with her, no part of him somewhere else. They talked about the future in the evenings in the way that people who have found each other talk about it, as a thing they are inhabiting together and building together rather than arriving at. They talked about the cabin, which needed a second room added for reasons they discussed with a combination of practicality and delight. They talked about Harriet, whom Effie wanted to have nearby and who was, she told Monroe one evening, growing older faster than she was comfortable admitting to herself. They talked about the homesteaders on the North End, and about Everett Pierce's suggestion that there might be legal pathways to securing the remaining claims more firmly against future challenges from Calhoun or anyone like him. Spring came to the mountain with an energy that was almost violent after the long stillness of winter, everything coming alive at once in a rush of green and water and bird noise. Monroe built the second room in April and May, working on it in the long spring evenings with Effie on the porch watching, and occasionally handing him things, and offering opinions on the window placement that he considered with genuine attention and incorporated into his decisions. The room went up with the same solid craftsmanship as everything else Monroe built, the walls plumb, the roof tight, the window framing exact. It was a good thing he had built it when he did, because Effie told him in June that she was expecting a child. He was at his workbench when she told him, and he set down whatever he was holding and turned and looked at her with that expression that she had come to understand. Was his face doing everything at once? The wave of feeling that was too large for his usual contained delivery moving visibly through him, breaking surface. He crossed to her in 2 strides and put his arms around her, and she felt the depth of it in his steadiness, in how still he went against her, the kind of still that is not absence of feeling but its full presence. "Are you all right?" he asked into her hair. "Very all right," she said. "Are you?" He pulled back enough to look at her, and his face was simply open and full and undisguised. "Yes," he said, "more than I know how to say." "You don't have to say it," she said. "I can see it." He smiled the full smile, and she thought again what she always thought when she saw it, that she would spend the rest of her life working to produce it as often as possible. The summer that followed was the warmest and most golden of the years Effie had been in Coldwater Creek. The schoolroom ran through August for the first time, because there were several families on the North End who wanted the children to advance their reading, and Effie was willing, and the children, somewhat to their own surprise, were also willing when the alternative was presented alongside an adequate amount of huckleberry picking on the Friday afternoons. Ada Cromwell helped with the younger children twice a week, a practical arrangement that had developed out of necessity and become something warmer, a friendship between the two women that was one of the things Effie counted when she counted the good things Coldwater Creek had given her. Monroe was, throughout Effie's pregnancy, attentive in the specifically practical way of a man who expresses love most naturally through care of the physical world around the person he loves. The firewood was always stacked before she could think about it. The trail to the main road was kept in excellent condition. The kitchen was reorganized twice to accommodate her changing relationship with certain smells. A specific kind of tea that helped with the morning difficulties of the first month was sourced from Hanley's general store and was never allowed to run out. He also talked to her more than she had expected, and she asked him about this one evening in July, sitting on the porch watching the light go off the mountain, and he said, with the characteristic careful honesty of a man who tells the truth about himself when he has examined it long enough, "I'm learning. You and the baby. You need things from me that are different from what I knew how to give before. You're doing very well, she said. I'm trying, he said. And this was one of the truest and most important things Monroe Carver ever said about himself. Not that he succeeded, but that he tried, with full attention and without reservation. Harriet came up the mountain in September, the 2nd September of Effie's time in Coldwater Creek, and she settled into the new second room with the matter-of-fact ease of a small woman who has spent 60 years making herself comfortable wherever she finds herself. She had ostensibly come to help with the imminent arrival of the baby, but she also brought her knitting and her opinions on every subject and an inexhaustible capacity for conversation that Monroe navigated with the patience of a man who understood that certain features of his landscape were not for his personal preference and did not need to be. The baby came in October. It was a boy, born in the cabin in the early hours of an October morning, with the first proper snowfall coming down outside the window and Harriet in attendance and Monroe present in the way that he was present for everything that mattered, completely, and without any distance between himself and the thing. They named him James Monroe Carver, the James for the man who had been loved and lost, and who had given Effie the courage and the history that had brought her to this mountain. The Monroe because it was also his father's name in a way that felt right, the doubling of it a bridge between what had been and what was now. Monroe held his son for the first time in the gray October dawn with the snow still falling outside, and looked at him with an expression Effie would remember for the rest of her life. The full, stunned, wondering openness of a man meeting something larger than anything he had previously encountered. "He's very small," Monroe said. "He'll grow," Effie said, which was the most she could manage from the depth of her tired satisfaction. "I know," Monroe said. "I know he will." He looked at Effie over the baby's head, and his face was the full open face, the full unguarded face, and she reached out and took his hand, and they held on to each other in the cabin on the mountain in the first snow of October, the three of them complete and certain. Harriet stayed through the winter, which extended Coldwater Creek's assessment of Monroe Carver's patience and deepened everyone's understanding of Harriet Blum's comprehensive opinions. And by spring, when the trail was clear and the mountain was greening again, Harriet had decided that she would move up to the mountain permanently, a decision she delivered as a statement rather than a question, and which Monroe received with the equanimity of a man who has been paying attention and is not surprised. He built her a proper room added to the back of the cabin over the course of the spring, solid and well lit, and with a view of the kitchen garden that Harriet and Effie were expanding together up the slope, a long terraced affair that was considerably more ambitious than what the cabin had had before, and which produced, by that summer, more vegetables than any of them could eat, and which therefore fed several of their neighbors as well. The years that built themselves on the foundation of that first year in Coldwater Creek were years of the specific deep happiness that is not constant joy but constant rightness, the feeling of a life fitting the people living it. Monroe continued to fix things for anyone who asked, which is to say he continued to fix things for everyone, because in Coldwater Creek asking Monroe Carver for help was simply how things worked. But the character of his work shifted slightly over those years, not in its generosity or its quality, but in its texture. He took on an apprentice, a 13-year-old named Felix Ward, whose family had come to the North End from Colorado, and whose facility with tools was immediately apparent to Monroe, and whose education he undertook with the same focused patience he brought to everything. Felix Ward would eventually become the finest craftsman in the Bitterroot Valley, and he would always say, when people asked where he had learned, that Monroe Carver had taught him that a thing that is broken is just a thing that needs attention, and that most things can be fixed if someone takes the time. Effie taught school in Coldwater Creek for 11 years before Reverend Aldrich, who had been talking about retirement for 5 of those 11 years, finally produced a proper certificated teacher from back east who could take over. She did not stop teaching then, exactly. She tutored children at the cabin for years afterward, particularly children who needed more careful instruction than a schoolroom setting could provide, and she extended her teaching to adult reading as well, working with several of the families on the North End who had come to Montana in the great waves of immigration that were transforming the territory. She was aware, in doing this work, of the larger currents of injustice moving through the territory and through the country, the continuing dispossession of the Blackfoot and the Crow, and the other peoples whose land this had been for generations before anyone like her had arrived in it. The pressure, and the violence, and the treaty breaking that continued year after year, with the implacable momentum of a policy that had never much concerned itself with the humanity of the people it was enacted upon. She could not fix that, and Monroe could not fix it, and this was one of the things that the word not everything covered when Monroe had said it on her first morning in Coldwater Creek, and she had said it back to him and he had acknowledged it. But she could teach, and she could notice. And she could, when opportunities presented, speak plainly about what was being done and to whom, which she did in letters to territorial newspapers and in conversations with Everett Pierce, who was engaged in legal work, she found admirable and supported where she could. The homestead claims on the North End were secured properly in 1881, through a combination of Pierce's legal work and a territorial judgment that went against the large ranching interests in a way that Calhoun Briggs's lawyers contested, and then, after considerable expense, abandoned. Calhoun Briggs himself sold his ranch in 1883 and went back east, and the land was divided between several smaller operators, which was not a perfect outcome, but was a better one than what had been facing Ada Cromwell and her neighbors 6 years earlier. Ada Cromwell continued to farm her land and eventually became a kind of anchor person for the North End community, the person everyone went to with problems the way people in the main town went to Monroe. She and Monroe had a productive mutual respect that expressed itself primarily in the exchange of practical assistance and the shared understanding of people who have helped each other through something significant. James Monroe Carver grew up on the mountain with his father's hands and his mother's eyes, and a combination of their two temperaments that was, everyone agreed, something particular and excellent. He was quick and observant and had Monroe's gift for physical intelligence and Effie's gift for attending to people, and he grew tall and broad like his father, and he learned to build things from Monroe starting when he was old enough to hold a hammer safely, which Monroe assessed at 7, and which Effie assessed at 9, and which they compromised on at 8. He also learned to read from Effie with the thoroughness of a child, who has been given to understand that books are something his parents genuinely love, and not merely something school requires, and this gave him a range and a curiosity that served him well. A second child arrived in 1882, a daughter they named Clara after Monroe's mother, and she was from the beginning a person of such direct and vivid personality that Monroe observed, once, that she had apparently come into the world knowing exactly what she thought about everything, which Harriet found hilarious and Effie found both true and impressive. Clara Carver grew up in the company of mountains and books and her father's steady example, and her mother's quick intelligence, and she was a formidable small person, the kind of child who asks why with genuine philosophical intent and does not accept unsatisfactory answers. Harriet Blum lived in her room at the back of the cabin until 1884, when she died in her sleep on a December night with the snow deep outside and the cabin warm, at an age and in a condition that Everett Pierce, who came out from Helena for the small funeral, described as what most of us are hoping for when we imagine how these things go. She was buried on the slope above the kitchen garden, in a spot Monroe had marked with a stone he had carved himself, and Effie wept for her with the full weight of what she had been, not just kin, but the person who had offered a door when everything was dark, and who had, with perfect quiet precision, handed Effie the life she had found here. After Harriet, The cabin had 4 rooms and a full workshop, and a kitchen garden that climbed the slope in terraces, and a porch that in the long summer evenings held 2 chairs, and occasionally a small crowd of neighbors, and the children of neighbors and Felix Ward, who came up the mountain regularly for the combination of Monroe's company and Effie's cooking, and the atmosphere of a place that had been made into something by the people in it. The town of Coldwater Creek continued to be itself, shaped by the years and by the forces that were reshaping the Montana Territory as it moved from territory to state, which it became in 1889, with the particular combination of ceremony and indifference that events of large political significance produce in small places, primarily concerned with their own immediate reality. The population grew somewhat. A second general store appeared, and then a land office, and then a small hotel that served the increasing traffic of people moving through the valley. The schoolroom was expanded into a proper school building in 1886, a project that Monroe supervised the construction of, and which he and Felix Ward and 3 other men built over the course of the spring, while Effie planned the interior with the focused competence of someone who had been thinking about what a good school building should look like for years. Monroe's reputation continued to spread in the way that reputations do when they are built on the pure accumulation of people who have been helped. People came from Finley Crossing and occasionally from further, with things that needed fixing and problems that needed the particular quality of attention that Monroe brought to whatever he was asked to do. He never turned anyone away. He never worked faster than the work required. He never produced anything less than what he was capable of. He was also, by the time his children were old enough to observe him clearly, visibly and completely happy, which was something he had not always been, and which Effie knew he had not always been, and which she held as one of the things she was proudest of in her life. Not that she had made him happy, because that was not how it worked, but that they had made the conditions together in which happiness was possible for both of them. One evening in the late summer of 1885, Monroe and Effie sat on the cabin porch in the long gold light, the mountain above them and the valley below, James off with Felix Ward learning something about metalwork and Clara asleep inside with the profound indifference to schedules that characterized her sleep, and the world was very still around them. Monroe had his arm along the back of Effie's chair, which was as close as he came to a casual gesture, and she was leaning slightly into him with the ease of years of closeness, and they were watching the light move down the valley the way they had watched it dozens and eventually hundreds of times before. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking about the Tuesday stage," he said, "when you came off it with the hat that was tied wrong." "The hat wasn't tied wrong. The ribbon was tied in a hurry." "It was tied wrong," he said with the placid certainty of a man who understands structural integrity. "But you had that look." "What look?" "The look of someone who has decided," he said. "Whatever is here, I am going to handle it. You had that look getting off the stage in a town you'd never seen." She considered this. "I was terrified," she said. "If that's what the look was." "That's what the look was," he said, "but you had decided anyway." She thought about the Tuesday stage, the creak of it and the smell of it and the long journey east to west that had delivered her to a single main street in the late afternoon sun with $42 and a cracked satchel and the profound uncertainty of everything. She thought about the man who had been crouched by a wagon wheel and had looked up at her 3 seconds and then looked back down. "You saw me," she said. "Before you said anything, I saw you look." A pause. "I saw you," he said. "And then you went back to the wheel." "There was still work to do," he said, which was so completely himself that she smiled. "But I saw you. And then you looked at my satchel strap and told me it was about to give." "It was about to give." "It was," she acknowledged. "You were right, as usual." He made a sound that was the compressed version of laughter, a warm, brief thing that she loved, and she leaned more completely into the solid warmth of him, and they sat watching the long evening lay itself down over the valley, over the creek catching the last light, over the rooftops of the town below, over the familiar improbable gift of all of it. "Monroe," she said, "yes, what needs mending?" It was what she had started saying in the years since that first conversation by the wagon wheel, when she wanted to check in, when she wanted to know what he was carrying, what the world had put on him that day. He had learned what it meant, and he answered it honestly always, because she had made it clear that it was a question she meant and deserved an answer to. He considered. "Nothing," he said. "Just now at this moment, nothing." She nodded. "Me neither." He took her hand, the same careful holding as the first time on the mountain trail, with the aspen leaves blazing gold around them. And the evening came down over the Bitterroot Range in the long, slow dark of high summer, and the mountain held them the way it held everything it had stood witness to over the long years, with the absolute reliability of something that was built to last. Clara slept inside. James was coming back up the trail. She could hear his boots on the gravel in the familiar pattern of her son moving through the world. Felix Ward's whistle was fading as he went back down toward town. Somewhere in the valley below, Ada Cromwell's cattle were moving to the lower pasture for the night. Everett Pierce had written that week to say the last of the homestead paperwork was fully settled and would hold, permanently, against any future challenge. The fire inside the cabin was burning low and would need banking. There were dishes on the kitchen counter. There was a letter she needed to write to the new school board. There was a length of fence on the north side of the property that Monroe had been meaning to look at for 3 days. There was always, in a life properly lived, something needing attention. Tomorrow there would be work and children and neighbors and the 10,000 small requirements of a day on a mountain in Montana in the year 1885. But right now, the evening was gold and the mountain was patient, and Monroe Carver was holding her hand and nothing needed mending. And that, Effie thought, was everything. Not the absence of difficulty or the end of grief or the promise that nothing would ever break again. She knew better than that now, had learned it in the specific practical school of a life that had been broken and rebuilt and broken again in smaller ways and rebuilt each time. Not that. Just this, the rightness of this moment and this man and this mountain, and the knowledge, deep and unassailable, that whatever came next would be met with the same full attention together, that everything worth anything had always required. Monroe turned and looked at her in the fading light, and his face was the face she loved, open and steady and entirely present. And he said nothing, because nothing needed saying, and she looked back at him with the full weight of all she was, and all she had brought to this mountain, and all that the mountain and this man had given her in return. The stars came out over the Bitterroot Range, one by one and then all at once, the way they did in Montana, where the sky was large enough to hold all of them. James came up the last stretch of trail and called out a greeting, and Monroe answered him in the comfortable shorthand of a father who knows his son's voice in any weather. Clara stirred inside and resettled. Clement in the small barn shifted and was still. The night came down fully over Coldwater Creek and the mountain above it, and in the cabin on the slope, the fire burned warm and the lamp was lit, and two people who had found each other on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1878 held onto what they had built and were held by it in return, the way good things hold the people who make them, faithfully and without end.